I want to thank everyone for coming. This is part of our 11th week of covering the war in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and Russia. We have a whole week of presentations that later in the week we'll have William Patrick, Wolfgang Schwang, who's on tonight as a viewer, Svet Jacqueline, who will be on Thursday. Ken Sedano was yesterday. We'll also have on Friday Katria Tomko, who is a subject matter expert who will discuss the propaganda aspects of the war. I thank our sponsors, which is Photo Shelter, Epson, Photo Daily, Archive Magazine, and American Photography. Also, so people know, I'm getting a lot of questions, especially after people getting their emails. I do want to do this with the Israeli Gaza conflict, that war. I guess we're going to call it a war. So that's sort of in the works, and just trying to secure photographers who are willing to do it. Um, I ask everyone to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And tonight we have Alan Chin. Alan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Frank. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I'll just introduce myself. I'm a photographer, and these days I'm also a bit of a writer. I also teach and mentor and whatever else I can do to make a buck and enjoy my day. But I'm about to show some work from Ukraine. I was actually in Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, which when you ask Ukrainians about the war, they'll tell you that, of course, the war did not start in February of 2022. It really started already in 2014 when when the Russians when the Russians annexed Crimea and incited the breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east of Ukraine. So really, it had already been going on for 8 years when the full-scale invasion began in February of 2022. And so I'm going to show some work since February of 2022. I've been to Ukraine 3 times, which is not as much as many of my esteemed colleagues and friends, but I'll show you a little bit of this work. I'm going to share my screen and 1 second. And so I'll kind of take you through from the beginning and then through just a few months ago, which was my last trip. So I've been there, yeah, 3 times for about a month or about 6 weeks each time in the last 2 years now, almost 2 years. In 2022, the reason I went is I was actually on press to print a book, a photo book of entirely different work, but we were using a Lithuanian printer. And so at the beginning of February, it was a short hop from Lithuania to Kiev, as the tensions were already brewing. And in those weeks before the war started, I'm just going to show you a few pictures. I went to Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city, and it's only 25 miles from the Russian border. So we really knew that. Wait, can you guys see my screen properly? It doesn't have
Yep.
any text on it or anything, does it?
No, we just have the full image.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I went to Kharkiv and I went to the ballet and the puppet theater. I mean, this is literally 2 nights before the war began. Um, and um, and it's you can see most Ukrainians, even though they felt that something might happen, they did not think it would be a full-scale invasion. And daily life continued up until the very moment that the first missiles and bombs hit the country and the first Russian troops, crossed the border. The restaurants and bars and cafes were full. The markets were full. There was no run on food or gas, or anything like that. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city and the center of much of its industry. It's where they actually built tanks. In the Soviet era, the tanks that they built in Kharkiv were considered the best ones in the Soviet army. And and usually they did not really like people there, but in the run up to the war, with the tension increasing, they actually invited journalists to come and check out the factory. So this is about a week before the war began, and we were able to see some of the weapons they were building. And also the factory where they build turbines, right? Kind of beautiful old heavy metal. And then the war began. It began local time about 5 a.m. and I was woken up by a phone call from New York. And I was told, "Do you hear anything?" It started. I said, "No, I don't hear anything." And I'll admit, I actually went back to sleep for about half an hour. And then I finally woke up properly and I went, this is the train station on the first day. And I'm going to bring you through this. You've probably seen this is a couple in a school that was coming under shelling closer to the front line. And so we were taking shelter, kind of under the beams of a building, right? Being, if you can't get into the basement, it's the next best thing to stand under a beam, just the same as if it were an earthquake, which, people who live in California probably know that. And here is, people in those first days in Kiev fleeing and heading west. As you probably know, millions of people left the country and millions of others left their homes in the east and center just to be in the more western regions. Here's a bomb shelter that was hastily set up in the basement of a church. The churches opened their doors. But again, and I really want to stress this, daily life continued, right? Ukraine is a large country. It is the size of France or Texas, approximately. It has 40 million people. And even a very big war, a war that's the largest since the Second World War in Europe, is, at any given moment in most of the country, if you're not close to a front line, you might not know that there's a war going on. And so when people say to me, "Oh, but isn't it crazy? Isn't it, this and that?" And the answer is, it's absolutely that at the front line. And in those initial weeks when the Russian army was being aggressive and on the move, you didn't necessarily know if they could attack a certain place or another because it was very fluid. But once the front lines kind of settled, and then once the Ukrainians in their two big successful counteroffensives, were able to reclaim some of the territory. Once that happened, and then as we all know, the last counteroffensive in this last year did not really succeed. Those front lines have been more or less static. And so that's very, very bad for anyone close to them. But it means that other than that, in most of Ukraine, other than the continuing threat of air and missile strikes, a lot of daily life both never stopped and also came back fairly quickly. For
And
example,
Alan,
go ahead.
so you're not near the front lines at the time. So are you looking for stories, or your editors back in New York saying, go here, we have a story for you? How does that work?
Yeah, I want to talk about that a bit. So I do have a
Okay.
9-year-old daughter, and my priorities now at this point of my life are a little bit different than they were when I was a younger person. And so I found myself close to the front lines a few times, but I mostly was not looking for it. And I really wanted to look more at process, what happens, and what I'm talking about, daily life. How does daily life continue in wartime? For example, this is a woman, a postal worker, and the post office was able to resume its normal operations 10 days into the war, and they have not stopped since. And you can go to your mailbox anywhere in the world, well, depending on your local postal service, but certainly in the US, you can go to your mailbox and you can drop in a letter or a package and it will show up in Ukraine and vice versa. Okay. It might take a little bit longer than before the war started, but that's totally functioning. And there's several reasons why the Ukrainians made it a priority. Number one, it's for a lot of senior citizens, it's how they receive their pensions. And for the entire population at large, it was a way, as is a lot of this stuff, of reasserting normality. It's a way of saying, listen, if you're not at the front line, life goes on. You need to mail a package, go ahead, do it. And so you can see, look, she's even stamping, the receipts, everything continues as normal.
That has to be patriotic as well, right? I would imagine.
I think for a lot of people it is. I think for a lot of people, the sense that you are going to show up at work every day, just as you always have, is really important. And this was true in other conflicts I've covered. In Sarajevo in the 90s, during the Bosnian War, there were people who would put on suits and ties to go to work. Now, in this war, famously, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has not been wearing a suit or tie. He's been wearing his, green sweater. But I think the point is made, right? That you go to work, you continue doing what you do. And so actually through a lucky coincidence, I got connected with the leadership of the Ukrainian railroads. So these guys you're looking at here are the leadership of the railroad. And this picture is actually on board a train moving at about 100 miles an hour. I was able to spend a bit of time with them during that first week of the war, and they had several missions. One, of course, is military, because the transport of troops and supplies and some of it is very dependent on trains as well as the road network. But secondly, they were responsible for evacuating most of those millions of people that we're talking about, both internally and abroad to Poland and further west. So Ukraine is the sixth largest railroad in the world, and they kept it running. And one thing that's kind of amazing, people ask me this. People ask me this. Isn't it really easy to destroy? Can't you just bomb the tracks and the railroad engines and locomotives and bridges and so actually of all the things that a railroad is dependent on, the only thing that's really hard to replace are the bridges. Everything else is actually really easy to repair. You blow up some tracks, well, guess what? 6 hours later, they're rebuilt. You blow up a locomotive, guess what? It's the world's sixth largest railroad. They have plenty of locomotives, right? And so I got to spend some time both with the leadership and on board these trains. You did see some heartbreaking situations, with people saying goodbye, not knowing when they'd see their loved ones again. Um, um, both at the trains, on board the trains and at the stations. And so this is in the early part of the war here in 2022. And then in 2023, the year just ended, I circled back. So at the end of the slideshow, you're going to see a few more pictures. But this, for example, this is on board an evacuation train. The trains were being packed with 3 or 4 times the normal number of people on board. And it was tough, but anyone can bear it for a few hours, and then they got to Poland. um and uh and it was pretty incredible to get to be on those trains. um and then, as you all probably know, once the first Ukrainian counteroffensive did succeed, the Russians were pushed out of the areas around the capital, Kiev. And we were able to go and see a lot of destroyed stuff because the fighting had been very intense in the suburbs of Kiev. And what you're looking here is a Russian fighter bomber, an Su-27, that was shot down by a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile. And it came down so hard that it created this little lake. The crater is big enough that it became a lake after it rained. And there was metal spread over around 3 or 4 football fields. The debris field was huge. And they told me that the pilot had survived, but that he had tried to escape, and so they killed him while he was trying to escape. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I was told. Frank, I see some things in the chat, so maybe you want to read them out.
Yeah, no, these were just comments about the post office. That there weren't questions. They were just comments on
Okay.
the work. I'm monitoring that.
Okay.
Yeah, and if
Um,
anyone has questions, just put them in the chat room and we'll get to them.
here's an oil facility, part of the infrastructure that was bombed, and you can see that's the crater that an aerial bomb will make in the ground. It's as tall as a person. The soldier went down into it to show me how deep it was.
And each of your stays, Alan, how long were they?
About the shortest was maybe 5 weeks, the longest was maybe 6 or 7.
Okay.
Yeah, so 3 times. for a total of, I don't know, 4 months, something like that. Um, this is Bucha. Again, this is where the Russians massacred a lot of the civilians, both on the streets and in these basements. And this is where I think in the early part of the war there was the initial shock, and then there was this moment where the opinion really took a further step. The sense that actually not only had they come in and attacked, but that there were all these atrocities, um, and civilian dead, and I think there was something very interesting that happened psychologically for a lot of people around this time. Yeah, this is Bucha and Irpin. These are these suburbs of Kiev. They're very close to the city center. It's really the difference of Jersey City to New York, but without even a big river, or Westchester County, or even Brooklyn compared to Manhattan. It's actually that close. People died that they could not properly bury. So there was a lot of this kind of cleanup in the days and weeks after the Russians were pushed out. And of course, these kind of pictures you've probably seen millions of, but then this was ubiquitous. You could just see the destroyed armor everywhere. And buildings, of course. Unfortunately, this has become this kind of repetitive imagery of modern war. Right? If you told me this building was Chechnya in 1996, or Sarajevo in 1992, or Baghdad in 2003, it could be any of these places, right? And unfortunately, it's one of the problems we have as photographers trying to document conflict, I think. But that's on the inside. So you see here, you see these holes that were made in the side of the building. Usually, that's the impact of what are probably tank shells. And from the inside, this is what it looks like, right? It can make a hole punching right through the wall. Now, what's amazing is they cleaned it up all relatively quickly. Again, daily life continued, the regular services of a society. The everything from your garbage pickup to your phone company, as we've already looked at, the post office and the train system. All these things continued to work, right? And that was really impressive. Like, it was almost as if they uh were ready for this in a way, at least in terms of dealing with scrap metal. And
Yeah.
obviously no one had planned it, but but they were able to clean it up incredibly fast. And you
Yeah.
can
So, Alan, you're with a fixer at the moment, right? Going through this.
sometimes I was and sometimes I wasn't. If I was working on a story with where I wanted to interview people, I would definitely work with a fixer because my Ukrainian and Russian language skills are not that good. But if I was just kind of cruising for imagery, which I did sometimes, I would just go with a fellow photographers, or a couple times even by myself. I speak enough to, I can say yes, no, please, thank you, up, down, right, left. I can navigate like the easy situations of getting around town and around the
Right.
countryside.
And
Um,
and but is there a piece like of you gaining knowledge of the people?
yeah,
How they clean
definitely.
up.
So
You
I
know,
did.
the
Yeah. So for example, this is Chernihiv, the city actually very close to the Russian border, north of Kiev. And yes, and for example, on this trip, I did want to interview some of these people. Like, these people we interviewed, the person translating for me, interpreting for me, they had spent, I think, about a month without any heat or hot water. And you can see behind them how their neighborhood was quite damaged. And I forgot the exact number now, but they said in that neighborhood, that about 50 of their neighbors were killed. So yeah, you want to get that kind of information. You want to find out what happened. And people are usually more than willing to tell you, because And this is a funny thing actually about being a journalist and a photographer. And in the US, sometimes we encounter people who don't want to be photographed, don't want to talk to the media, are very suspicious. This idea of fake news is very prevalent. But in places like Ukraine, for the most part, I almost feel like because we are, and there's also, and I realize I'm going off on a few tangents. There's also this other thing that, who am I? I'm an American, I'm a parachute journalist, shouldn't a Ukrainian be doing this? And first of all, Ukrainians are doing this. But secondly, I think sometimes when you're not from a place and you show up, you're actually, the people really want to talk to you. They really want to tell you their story. And in a way, it's even a little bit psychological where I feel they feel that they're finally able to tell the world about what happened to them. And you have to be very careful. I have to tell people, look, even if I'm an assignment for, and I'm gonna publish a story and the pictures will be published, it doesn't mean anyone's gonna care about them individually, right? Usually not. I mean, in extreme cases, sure, but most of the time, absolutely not. And so I try to say that. I try to say, look, I really appreciate you telling me this, but I cannot promise that, your life will be better because you talk to me, right? And that's a tricky one because sometimes people hope that by talking to a journalist that they'll get more assistance or, that someone will pay more attention to them and, so on. The cemeteries, as you know, began to fill up very, very fast with all these people being killed. Um, and yeah, it was just, and this woman we talked to for at least 20 minutes. She had actually worked in the film industry in Kiev before she retired. And you learn amazing things, right? You look at an old lady like this, you don't necessarily think, oh, 20 years ago she was actually like a producer, like kind of amazing. um and this is one of the spookiest things I came across, is dead horses in the middle of the road. And I don't know who killed them. I don't know how they were killed. They certainly have been dead for some time. And this is near Hostomel, which is the airfield that the Russians tried to seize on the first day of the war, but then they were pushed out by a Ukrainian counterattack eventually. So there was a lot of fighting in this region. Um, but I don't know. I look at my own picture here and I am reminded of things I've read and seen from the First and Second World Wars. And in fact, if you read the great Polish journalist Kapuscinski's book about the end of the Soviet Union, it's called Imperium. The very first scene is set in September 1939 in Poland, and he's describing these dead horses. And I reread that recently, and it just chilled me because it's like, wow, here I am in 2022. Here I am in 2022, and I'm looking at exactly the same thing that Kapuscinski experienced in 1939, right?
Amazing.
Um, this is a woman who took us into her apartment. The building was heavily damaged. Her apartment, luckily, was not, but they could not live there. There was no, the windows were broken. There was no water or electricity. So they were coming back just to gather some valuables and, try to make a plan about when they could come back to more properly fix things. It was their first time back since their building had been hit. So you learn all these details, right? This is a little bit horrible. This is someone had clearly died here. That's a piece of a jaw, right? Most of my pictures are not particularly bloody compared to some of my friends and colleagues, but you can't avoid it, right? It is the reality. And then you see some of this. This is actually the Polish president visiting. All these dignitaries would come in this first year of the war. People would come and show their support, and the Ukrainians would take them around. And I did not know this. This was not assigned. I just happened to be in this town called Borodanka, which was very heavily hit. And all of a sudden, this convoy of SUVs shows up, and all these heavily armed guys come out, and so sometimes you see very odd things. I went back to Kharkiv, where I had spent a week before the war started. And going back to Kharkiv a couple months into the war, it was a very different city. It had been shelled very heavily. It was actually still under shelling at this time. The Ukrainians were trying to push them out after I took these pictures. The Ukrainians were able to push them out more, but at this time the Russians have been pushed out of the city itself. But their artillery was still able to hit the northern neighborhoods, an area called Saltivka. What you're looking here was once one of the largest markets in Europe, selling, and it was the kind of place which is a shopper's paradise. And the reason it was so big is actually because they were close to Russia, and until the relationship became bad in 2014, Russians would come across the border here to buy blue jeans or whatever. It was a real. It's like several hundred. I don't even know how many, maybe even almost 1,000 small shops. And you could buy anything from blue jeans to massive amounts of toilet paper to food, you name it, right? They had computers, electronics, there were different little alleys for different things. And unfortunately it was hit and a lot of it burned.
Yes, so Alan, you said that you also write. When you walk through a market like that, what are some of the emotions you go through? Because you could feel it alive as you describe it. What does it feel like to walk through that?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, you realize just how stupid how much of war is, right? Because that is not a military target, right? There is it's a commercial marketplace, and there's very little way to justify why you would choose to hit that. Now, let's just be fair. Maybe it was a mistake, right? Maybe it was a wrong targeting. But if it was, then that's also so wasteful, right? So instead of hitting an actual military target, you blew up 600 tons of fabric and cooking oil. Just a waste. And I think a couple of people died when it was hit. I'm not sure. It was not large numbers because most of the stores were already closed, of course. But yeah, it's just the senselessness of it, yeah, that's and I had been there just, like I was saying, the month before, 2 months before when it was bustling, right? And when it was bustling, I had tried to make pictures there as part of my story about Kharkiv on the eve of war, and I ended up not actually using any of those pictures, but it was it was still a bustling place before, and then it was just burnt out. People were sleeping in the subway, in the metro, and this was kind of um, epic in a way. They had parked the trains in each station, and people were sleeping inside and on the platform. Um, and the Kharkiv Puppet Theater, which is one of the coolest theaters anywhere, they're very avant-garde. They're not like your usual. It's not what you think. They do children's shows, but they also do shows for adults. They, for a while, had about 70 actors and their families and other staff members from the theater sleeping in the theater building. And then they started performing in the subways, in the metro, right? Because and so this is a show for kids here, and they're doing a puppet show for children in the metro station. That was just incredible to see. Um, Here's a family that was very lucky. The reason that they were living in a frontline village, like north of Kharkiv, in an area where there was active fighting, they had been stuck there for about a month because it was literally on the front line. And Ukrainians finally were able to push forward a little bit the day before, and they opened up what they call a green corridor so that the people from this village could escape. But even as they were trying to do that, as they told me, so this is a brother and a sister, and their other brother, and I think one of their parents was with them too. Um, they told me that a shell or a rocket, something hit right behind them, like 2 car lengths behind them. But luckily, there was a big truck or a van in between where it hit and them. So all the windows or the back window of their car broke, and they were very shaken up, but no one was hurt. They had a very close call. But you can really see it on her face. I mean, she did not enjoy that experience. And this, okay, so back to the market, right? So this is the part of it that wasn't burnt out, but it was boarded up, and of all those formerly hundreds of businesses, there was only one or two places where they were distributing humanitarian aid. Uh,
Your point is well taken about, where the war is not happening, everyone's living sort of this normal life. Everyone's dressed nicely. It's amazing.
to a degree, but see,
Yeah,
the war comes to you, right?
right.
Because the people come from the village 20 miles away that they've escaped just today, and they're really shaken up, and now we have to find somewhere for them to live and feed them and so on. Here's another. I think it was a group of people that had just escaped a more frontline area, and he had, I think he had low blood sugar or something. He collapsed. He was okay, but he had a tough moment there. Um, and again, this is another blown up tank, but the reason I include this one is because I love that Soviet monument behind. All over Ukraine, you see these monuments to the Second World War. Some of them have been removed as Ukrainians increasingly reject the Soviet past, but some of them remain because, of course, the Ukrainians fought against Nazi Germany, right? So it's a little bit tricky. Some is a monument sometimes just celebrating the Soviet and Russian imperialism, or at other times is it actually about this shared legacy of fighting Nazis together, right? It's tricky. It's very tricky, and so a lot of them are still around. Um, uh, and here's the Ukrainian. This is from an assignment I did for an NGO. It's called Right to Protection, R2P. They're one of the Ukrainian nonprofits that has really stepped up. They were providing direct assistance to people, ranging from direct cash assistance to housing to all kinds of social services. They went for I think they were expanding and opening offices and but this was one of the places they were supporting. This is a school building turned into a temporary housing for internally displaced people, and you can see the cats as well.
Yeah, do you still have a lot of the grassroots volunteerism and aid coming in as much as it was, say 6 months or a year ago?
Oh, I don't know how to gauge that because I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but there is no question that the Ukraine itself has an incredibly vibrant nonprofit sector of volunteerism and really part of that is because it really already started in 2014, right? The reason that the in fact in the early, I'm just going to do a little history here, in 2014 and 2015, in the early days of this conflict, the Ukrainian army, such as it was not yet very effective, right? Because it was this moment of unrest, and they had just were coming out of this post-Soviet period, and dozens of what were called volunteer battalions actually formed of people just picking up weapons and organizing and going to fight. And so those volunteer soldiers have all became regularized. They became integrated into the regular army. The most well-known one is the Azov initially battalion that fought in Mariupol area, which initially had some very right-wing founders, and there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation about that. But they've actually been part of the regular Ukrainian army for the last 5 years now. So again, they still have the name Azov. But on the civilian side also, right? So this is the kitchen, the kind of communal kitchen where they're feeding several hundred people. And is it still as strong as it was before? I don't know the numbers, but I know on my own social media pages where I have a lot of Ukrainian friends, I still see a lot of appeals. People ask to fundraise to buy drones for the army. They continue to ask to for people to donate for these things. And this is, for example, this is a place where people were lining up to get direct cash assistance. Not a lot. I think it was just like $50 or $100. But if they had been displaced, it's the difference between not having anything and having at least a few dollars in your pocket to get to the next thing. So everything you looked at here up until now was the 2 trips I did in 2022. Now it's the year just ended, 2023. And one big change is this kind of regularization, right? So this is the town of Kupiansk. It's one of the places where the Russians have been on the offense again. This is actually when they started it in the summer, and you can see that that plume of smoke rising. But you can also see this local resident with a very stylishly ripped jeans, and she's just chatting away on the phone. And it was very weird for me because usually you try to gauge how bad an area is by seeing what people are doing, right? If it's totally empty, if there's no one around, you know that maybe, okay, we're getting close to the front. But if you see people chatting on the phone, riding their bicycle around, going fishing, your normal mind is thinking it can't be that bad because people are doing all these normal things. Well, in this case, the war has been going on long enough and people have been used to it long enough that they begin to do what look like very normal things, even when the shelling can be quite close. And for me, that was psychologically kind of tricky. Uh, a lot of you see a lot of this, of course, blown up bridges. Some of these were destroyed by the Ukrainians themselves to make it hard for the Russians to attack. And then when they reclaimed areas, of course, they still haven't, replaced them. This is amazing. This is in the town of Izium. This is part of the region that was recaptured in that second counteroffensive. And it's a monument to the Second World War. And at the right, the white monument is to the Russian Revolution of 1917 to 1921. So, and this is the highest point for maybe 100 miles around. During the Second World War, 3 massive battles were fought close to here against the Nazis, right? And so you see the monument's been damaged, but it still stands. Um, this is a sad story. This is an apartment building in Izum that was hit by an aerial bomb, and over 50 civilians died in this building because they were taking shelter in the basement. They were using the basement as a bomb shelter, but the bomb was too big. It went right through the building, all the way into the basement, and exploded, destroyed most of the building, and killed over 50 people. And so many months later, you can see, or actually even almost a year later at this point, you can still see how it's frozen in time, people's belongings in those closets, they're just still there. These are some of the people that refuse to leave those areas very close. This is literally about 800 meters from the front, from the Russian positions. Okay, this is not the house behind him, but maybe like 1 block away is already the first Ukrainian frontline position. And I asked them, why don't you guys leave? And they gave the answer that people always do in these situations. I said, why would we leave? We've always lived there. Where would we go?
And do you get a sense that it's been a while since journalists have been back there to that particular place? Do you get any sense of that, Alan?
I don't I don't know. I mean, there's always journalists wandering around. I don't know. I think some of it depends. The Ukrainian military, like all militaries, is runs hot and cold. We were talking about access a little earlier. In some areas, it's a little bit easier to accompany them. In other areas, they're a little bit more sticklers. In this particular area, we weren't even meaning to, but we basically ran into this group of soldiers at a grocery store, and they said, "You have to come with us." And I was like, why do we have to come with you? And they said, we want to show you our frontline position. And I said, well, I'm not actually really looking for that. They're saying, well, what are you here for? Come on, let's go. So of course we went, and so this is in a bunker, right on the front line. They'd been there for a while. And here they are firing this machine gun. It's called a dushka. It's a heavy machine gun, 50 caliber. And it's a little bit like, okay, if you're shooting at them, they're going to shoot back, right? Like, I don't really want to be here. And indeed, one of these guys, the guy who was firing the machine gun, this guy, he was killed a couple of weeks later. So it's life and death at the front. And this was in the car with them, right? I forget whether it was going to or from their most forward position near Kupiansk. This is one of the monasteries that I really wanted to visit. They've been hit a couple times, and it's just kind of ironic because it was Russians shelling that hit them, but they belong to the part of the Orthodox Church that's actually pro-Russian, and blah blah blah. So I wanted to check it out, but they were actually quite hostile, unusually to journalists. They didn't really want me photographing. They didn't want to talk. So I kind of just hung out and checked out the beautiful river. Another destroyed bridge. And here is so in this is the city of Mykolaiv, and I know this is also in Kiev in one of the central squares, and maybe in other cities too, where the destroyed, other than the rapid cleanup, right, which I talked about a little earlier, but they've moved, in this case, about a dozen destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles into the main square as a kind of ad hoc museum, and you can see people come and they make selfies, they photograph it, and so this is definitely the first war that I think where the smartphone is so ubiquitous, right? I mean, we've already had flip phones and things like that for 20 years now, but I think it's the first time that the majority of people have smartphones.
Alan, in the other conflicts that you've covered, have you seen that also, where they'll take the enemy's hardware and do photographs in front of them? I mean, or is that just something that's unique to this situation?
I don't think it's unique to this situation, but it's definitely been very prominent in Ukraine. So I wanted to circle back to see how the trains were doing. And I spent some more time with them. And a year and a half into the war, it's very different, right? It's no longer a mad rush to evacuate millions of people. It's the constant stresses of keeping the system running, but even improving it, right? So with the help of UNICEF, they opened, this is in Kiev's main train station, they opened the center for families. And I asked the guy, he's a railroad executive. I asked him, this is great, but some people might say, aren't your priorities a little misdirected? Isn't this a little bit frivolous, right? And he said, not at all. If we don't make this attractive, if we don't actually try again to restore all the things of not just restore, but even improve on all the things of daily life, people are not going to want to come back. How do they say to someone who fled in the early weeks or months of the war to say, it's okay, you can come back. We want you back at your job. We want you back, or, whatever, right? So for them, again, they are dealing with a damaged infrastructure. This is a rail depot that was hit. But and you see this everywhere, right? You've probably seen a lot of pictures like this, the unexploded or spent shelling. This is all stuff, this is all railroad facilities. So it does show that they have been hit. But again, you can destroy their buildings, but it doesn't stop the trains from running, right? Which is the most important thing. And so here's a railroad worker who was wounded. I think several hundred railroad workers have now been killed. But they have a workforce of over 100,000, right? I think actually over 200,000.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's really sort of interesting, Alan, how, they have a plan to get people back, right?
yes,
Like
absolutely.
you're in the throes of it, but we have to think about how we're gonna, get this country back on its feet. It's amazing.
Well, and another thing the railroad is really thinking about, it's of course still mostly an old Soviet system. It's not handicap accessible, but now we have a country where there are tens of thousands of new amputees, including this guy. He's a soldier who lost his leg in action, and he just got out of the rehab, and he's actually waiting for a train to take him home. And they told me, yeah, so they're actually building elevators, right? This is a train station with a lot of stairs and steps, right? If you go there with a wheelchair now, as that guy did, you have a lot to navigate. And so literally this is construction, you can see there on the left, that's the new elevator shaft that they're putting in, so that the guy said it to me. He said, we have, yeah, I think the last count, it was at least 30,000 new amputees. and they have to serve these people, right? Because the train, again, is the main way of getting around. So this is the train repair facility where they repair and build rail cars, including making them accessible. So they've been converting some of these to have ramps instead of steps and things like that. And it's a mix, of course, of the old technology with some new technology. And this was incredible. So they started using hospital trains for, I think, the first time since World War II. This is a fully equipped ICU with 5 intensive care beds on this car. And the hospital train has the ICU with the 5 intensive care beds, and then it has several other cars for the less badly wounded, so they're not so intensive, but still to transport. And basically, what they do is obviously the train doesn't go to the very front line, and in fact, I think there was an article in the Times or the Washington Post in the last couple of days about how hard it is to even evacuate the wounded from the front, right? But once they're evacuated from the front and they're stabilized, then there is not enough intensive care beds for them in the big cities in the east, in Kharkiv or Dnipro or any of those places. So they have to be brought back to Kiev, to Lviv, to Odessa, or even abroad, right, for more advanced surgery and rehabilitation. And so they've been using these trains to do it. And they let me go one night when so these trains pull in every night, and there's a long line of ambulances waiting to transport them to hospitals, right? So they're unloading the train and putting these guys onto ambulances where they get taken to their next facility. And you can see this guy lost an arm. This guy, you can see, was very badly wounded. Still with the blood not quite clean, the bandage not yet replaced. This guy, his leg was, I think, hit quite badly. So that's a very sobering sight, Yes, on the one hand, they're putting in this kind of cheerful children's area to welcome people coming back from abroad. But on the other hand, every day they are unloading these hospital trains in the same train station.
But I mean, you have to be working on different cylinders, right?
Yeah,
As a government and as a society,
correct.
seeing that hospital car, I mean, really is sort of hopeful.
In a way, but it's a
Yeah.
real reminder of the high cost.
Yeah.
This is just a fun picture. Ukrainian cowboys ride bicycles. And this was leaving on, so basically there is still no air travel in Ukraine because of the contested airspace. And so to enter or leave the country, you have to take the train. And I took the train to leave. But instead of being on board a packed refugee train this last trip, it was a comfortable second class sleeping car. And that's it.
Wow. Mm. So what are your plans, Alan? I mean, when do you plan on going back? And are you going back on your own dime? Is it on assignment? How's that working?
So yeah, so
Because we
I
discussed before
actually,
about
yeah,
the media outlets.
let me just very quickly we'll take some questions. I see some hands up, but let me just quickly share my screen again to show one thing. And so, for example, the the stories on the train. The first one I did at the beginning of the war was for Business Insider, which is here, right? This is the first week of the war, but going back a year later, they actually did not want the story. The appetite is no longer what it was. And I was able to place it, but with foreign policy, a very different outlet. So that's kind of life as a freelance photographer and journalist. It's just the reality. Yeah. But we had some questions. So why don't we take some questions? I think Stefan had a question. Is that right?
I was actually clapping in support.
Seven was applauding.
But
Oh,
you just said something that would have been my question. How is the how many people are still working there, like compared to half a year ago or so? Does
Journalists, you mean, or
journalists, yeah. I mean, does the lesser interest lead to lesser people working there?
I mean, compared to the very beginning of the war, yes, of course. But I think after the first few months, I think it's kind of settled where, people come and go. I think Ken and Wolfgang can probably speak to this as well, and Svet, and others. Um, but yeah, I think it comes and goes, are the assignments, and before we officially started today, I was talking to Frank, I don't want to sound like one of these old fogies talking about how it was so much better, 20 years ago. I'm sure there are people working now, 20 years from now, who will say, oh, it was so much better back in 2024. It's just what it is. We live in constantly evolving media landscape. And, if I had half a brain, I certainly would have done something else with my life, right? Certainly from the point of view of income.
But we were also discussing how we're all waiting now for the economic aid, whether it's from the States or from Europe, and that'll dictate more action, dare I say, action happening when, there's more military might on the Ukraine side that, may get, something to move. And
Yeah,
we'll
I'll say this too: the failure of the much heralded, over heralded counteroffensive in the last year, I think, and the consequent. We talked about this, how the front lines haven't really moved very much. I think that has definitely led to people losing interest and yes, politically losing the desire to fund and provide weapons. And we're actually entering a pretty dangerous moment for Ukraine, where if they don't get more stuff soon, they're gonna they're gonna have to definitely rethink how they fight this war. So yeah, and if things change, either a significant Ukrainian advance or a significant Russian one, that will pop the interest up again, and so on and so on. But yeah,
yeah,
all wars kind of go
yeah.
this way, right?
Yeah, I don't know if Ken or Wolfgang or you, Alan, can speak to, what's going on in the editorial, rooms of these different outlets. Are they saying, we can't fund this because, we can't send everybody again because there's no action happening because there's a stalemate in Congress and on and on and on. Do you get that kind of a feeling? You know,
I mean, I just think it all really depends. Yeah.
yeah.
I think so. For the wire that I work with, the past 2 months, it's been all Israel. Palestine is kind of where they're selling the most material. So they've had people there, but in the next month, it's going to be the 2 years for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think focus will go back over to that for a little bit now that there's like essentially zero access for Gaza. So it's kind of the same material coming out of there. I think these things ebb and flow, like what Alan said.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and I am trying to get back in time for the second anniversary. I do think there will be a spike in interest. I do think it will also be a good moment to kind of see again how the war is evolving. I really have to stress again, and I hope some of my pictures have shown this. Mine are not the most exciting pictures you're going to see. They're not dramatic. There's not that much action in them. And if it was not for the context, if we change the captions on these pictures and we said this is just daily life, in Oklahoma. Well, it doesn't look like Oklahoma, but you know what I mean. If this is just daily life in any other country in a normal time at peace, for more than half these pictures, you would not know the difference, right? And that is in a way both the strength and weakness of visual storytelling, right? Like sometimes there's a reason why pictures that are very dramatic, of course, are important and are seen more because they show you exactly what's happening. In this case, it would be the death and the destruction. But the images of daily life, I think, in some ways are equally important,
Absolutely.
because they are the counter narrative, right? I know that in the recent round of Russian airstrikes a number of Ukrainian civilians, a significant number of Ukrainian civilians were killed in the last week. But before that, since the summer, in the 6 months before that, I am almost certain that the number of Ukrainian civilians, not soldiers, but Ukrainian civilians killed by Russian airstrikes is probably lower than the average number of people killed by gun violence, certainly in certain parts of the US. So, so you have to think of it that way. And obviously I don't think anyone in Ukraine can forget about the war, but that doesn't mean that, they can't go out to dinner, or they can't go to the theaters that have reopened, or they can't go and try to continue their normal lives.
Yeah, it's sort of intriguing how it does ebb and flow, and now you can gear up for the 2-year anniversary, not knowing if anything's really going to change, other than it's the 2-year anniversary, right? Like what's going to change on the ground, and
Frank, it's Anya. If I can just chime in, and Alan, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. I think, though, that one of the things that we're finding, having relatives living there right now and in contact with them directly, is that while they're going back to daily lives, meaning they're not hiding in shelters, it's not the same lives they had before. Many of them, had to quit their careers that they're doing, to your point, have been supporting the conflict since 2014. The PTSD that some of these guys are experiencing. My own cousin, who's got 2 daughters in her early 20s, she feels like, my life, she's only in her 50s, and she says, well, my life is what it was. But these girls are living lives in their 20-year-olds and not the way they should be living. One of them, who's her boyfriend, had both his arm and leg shot off in the war, etc. So I'm not countering what you're saying, but I also want to make sure that while, yes, people have to get up and live, and they have to go to work, and they have to eat, they know the war is going on, and the impact on them, particularly psychologically, is immeasurable at this point. So
absolutely, and to be fair, I read a kind of darkly funny story recently. I mean, it's not funny at all, really. But to that point, I read a story recently how about there was a protest because there was a sense that the government, in its efforts to maintain normal life, was actually spending too much money and effort on that, right? There's not, I think one of the pull quotes was something like, we don't really need the city park renovated right now. That money maybe should be going towards the war effort. So yes, for sure, right? And I think the impact of this war in the best case scenario is going to be felt for generations, right? I mean, there's no way that it won't be. That's all absolutely true.
Yeah, and Alan, as you go back, what's going to be your focus to cover?
Well, I'm going to check in on my guys on the train again. I want to do more on the trains. I actually do want to, if I can, I don't think it'll be easy to get access, but if the American and European assistance is going to get curtailed or reduced or even cut off, I want to focus a little bit on what the Ukrainians are doing themselves. I know there are some efforts, including efforts supported by the US to build up the Ukrainian arms industry itself, right? Because if we can't give them, if Congress is not willing to vote and provide X number of Patriot missiles that are needed, well, maybe Ukraine can build them right there, right? So they are thinking of creative and important ways to get around this. So I'd love to look at that. I've long actually wanted to do a story on the oil and gas industry in Ukraine. Ukraine is a significant natural gas producer, and as you know, there are actually Russian pipelines that go through Ukraine to Europe, and and so on, and the whole kind of political and economic context around energy is really important. Not easy to cover, not easy to get access, not easy to photograph in an interesting way, but I think very important. Yeah, so those are some of the things I'm interested in addition, obviously, to the ebb and flow of the war itself and so on.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Any comments from anybody else? Wolfgang,
I just wanted
while
to
we
say I
have you
really-
on, who's talking?
Wolfgang.
Oh, I was. I was.
Yeah, I mean,
I just wanted to say the Ukrainian cowboys ride bicycles. That line, I like that a lot. There's been more times than I can count that I've had like a debate on like, is my car going to get stuck in the mud driving on some like awful back road in Donbass, and then like this like old man riding his like single speed bicycle like at like just fast enough to like not fall over, cruises by through the mud on that. Like the bicycle, not community, but like just like the how many people ride bikes there on like the worst roads imaginable is something else.
No, it's but so that's part of the things I love about Ukraine. On the one hand, it has this really, and this is one of the reasons, causes of the war, not reason for the war, but Ukraine has this really exciting developing tech sector. Almost every person you meet under the age of 35, with a college education, what did they do before the war? Oh, they were in tech. They're a programmer. They're a coder. They're a, whatever, doing social media, right? Like it's actually a kind of Eastern European Silicon Valley of sorts, or was becoming that, had promise of that eventually, right? And then on the other hand, you still have this eternal life in the villages, right? With farming and unchanging, yeah, dirt roads and kind of the it's easy to romanticize in a way if you don't live it yourself. But yeah, definitely the these kind of it seems to me like from another age, right? Yeah, people on farmers and in the countryside. Exactly what Wolfgang's mentioning.
Frank, it's Anya again. I actually have a picture I want to send to you. It will in nowhere compete with any of these pictures that these terrific photojournalists have shared with you. But when we were in Ukraine in 2011, I took a picture of a farmer on with a horse and buggy. I mean, this is like old time buggy, right? And he's on a horse and buggy, and on both sides of him are two guys hanging off, talking on their cell phones. It was just such
oh,
a.
really?
I'll send it to you. It's just
Yeah, please.
the car just to take a picture of them because it was ridiculous. As far as the mode of transportation was a la 1920, but they were on their phones.
Send that through, and we'll give you a photo credit on that as well.
Oh, okay, thanks.
I don't want to get that. Yeah, that sounds great. Just the way you describe it gives us a visual experience that's pretty clear.
There's
That's
an app I use to process my photographs, and it's Skylum Neo, and it's all in Ukraine. The company Skylum is in Ukraine.
Oh, there you go. One
They've
of the tech
been
companies, yeah.
working 100% through the war. I mean, if you send them a question, you'll get an answer within a day, within 24 hours. I don't know how they're doing it. I don't know where they are.
Yeah, you know what, Sandy? Put it in the chat room, the name of the company. Type it in.
Well, this is true in the Baltic states also. It's true to a degree in Poland. It's true throughout the former, Eastern Europe, right? Because they, in a way, they had to leapfrog a generation, right? So they had to go from really obsolete and antiquated technology into the 21st century. And, part of that, of course, means they still have to catch up in some ways. But the other part means that they are able to innovate at a relatively low cost. And yeah, and I think that is one of the tensions, right? This is why Ukraine politically and culturally has been looking to the West, looking to join the European Union. And of course, Putin and the Russians have had their issues with that. So anyway, part of the larger picture.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. And really appreciate everyone being patient and checking some of this out.
No, and thank you for
Thanks,
bringing
Alan.
to us the human side of what's going on, in the streets. It's really important to get a full rounded picture. So yeah, I appreciate everyone coming in. We continue for the rest of the week. We have William Patrick tomorrow. We have Svet Jacqueline on Thursday, and we have Wolfgang Schwan on Friday with Katria Tomko. So we still have an action-packed week. And I really, really do appreciate everyone coming in. I know there's 1,000 different things to be doing all the time. So I really appreciate it. And Alan, you get the last word. Send us off tonight with some wisdom.
I really don't have any other than, I really encourage everyone to continue following the story, and not let it be forgotten, no matter what else might be equally important at any given moment, right? It is the long haul now, and the war will continue, and it will, there will be outcomes, and those outcomes are not going to be less important just because we don't have an eye on it as closely as we might have at the beginning. So
Okay. Right. Well, that's you're 100% right. 100% right. So again, I thank everybody, and I look forward to seeing everyone the rest of the week. And like I said, we'll see Wolfgang on Friday.